strategies of visibility. In 1938, the Serbian avant-garde writer and critic Ljubomir Mitic was publishing in Paris Barbara Genie, le décivilisateur, Barbara Genius, the civilizer, a manifesto novel that proclaimed the Balkanization of Europe. Barbara Genius embodied the primitive vitality of the Balkan artists. The son of Xenophon, a noble barbarian killed by civilization and of Fata Morgana, the illusory genius of civilized Europe, he was the providential hero who could save Europe from its mannerist demons. We seek a new man of barbaric force, proclaimed the novel. And as a matter of fact, a number of artists from that area insufflated at that time a new vitality to the European art. But if Micic's Barbarogenius echoed Benjamin's barbaric love from the 1933 essay Erfahrung und Armut, Experience and Poverty, while reminding one the strong inclination that avant-garde artists had for primitivism in general, his novel had a meta-message to deliver. Living for several years in Paris, which was then one of the most effervescent centers producers of culture, Micic was appalled by the discrepancy existing between these centers and all the other places consequently outlined as peripheries. Hence, as a manifesto, Barbarogenius might have been evocative for the avant-garde movement, but it represented in the first place a strategy of visibility for the peripheries. Micic was the only Eastern European, was not the only Eastern European to think about such strategies. In art history, a new trend started to be developed after the World War I around the theories of Józef Strigowski, an Austrian citizen of Polish origin trained in Vienna, Berlin, and Munich. Opposed to the centric vision of the Vienna school, Strigowski elaborated a geohistorical approach integrating peripheries to the mainstream discourse thanks to transfers, circulations, and correspondences, otherwise the theme of our conference today. If his methodology was greatly influential in the early 20th century, especially among scholars from Central and Eastern European countries, it had no impact on the nascent historiography of modern architecture. Not only that his extreme nationalism played against him, but the main reason was the rupture between history seen as a closed chapter and as prefiguring the modern movement. That was something that was discussed already here in the first round table yesterday. Leaving now aside modern barbarians and Polish art historians, I will attempt to briefly sketch how architectural historiography included or ignored Eastern Europe. I look at this latter in a broad geographical perspective, whose limits are mostly determined by the idea of otherness. I don't know if you can see, but there are some nice captions over there. Thank you, Sibel. So Eastern Europe is about Hungary, actually, according to Google. So I will attempt to briefly sketch this letter in a broad geographical perspective, whose limits are mostly determined by the idea of otherness. And chronologically, I will include the 19th century only when the long durée will help to contextualize the 20th century. Otherwise said, I will follow the thread of modernity instead of modernism. This being said, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different in comparison with the other two papers, because I'm going to talk about a certain elusive compared structure as opposed to two entities, Turkey and Brazil. And now, a little bit on identifying peripheries. The status of marginality implies a set of patterns which are defined as such by a center, aside the geographical distance from the center. Alterity, be it cultural and or political, contributes significantly in the process of peripheralization. From this point of view, Eastern Europe is twice a periphery, defined as the internal other, starting with the Enlightenment, as showed Larry Wolff in his Inventing Eastern Europe. It was marginalized a second time by the polarization of the Cold War. Though its alterity was ambiguous, not too far, like South America, for instance, not too different, like Turkey embodying here the Orient, its status of periphery remains effective in spite of globalization and geopolitical assessments. Reassessments, actually. Hence, its strategies and tactics of visibility are still active. Apparently changed. The mechanics of this latter is the same, evolving between contextualization and decontextualization. Contextualization because required for the sake of comprehensibility. How can a periphery be visible when its history is not legible? Decontextualization because engendered by the desire to follow no matter what the canon and thus wipe off all specificities which precisely would demand for contextualization. I argue that strategies and tactics altogether are a matter of vicious circles. Contextualization stamps Eastern Europe as different, sort of as a niche product, while decontextualization situates it as marginal. The canon on peripherality, and if ever I will have time, I will be happy to comment this image afterwards. The narrative of art, architectural historiography, was based from its beginnings and continues to be on the notion of value. Rigo laid in two seminal works, Late Roman Art Industry in 1901 and The Modern Cult of Monuments 2 years later, the theoretical ground for setting this notion as fundamental in defining both the work of art and the territories of art history. Seen as creative, I quote, centers and copying peripheries. Generally speaking, Eastern Europe is most often assimilated to the latter in the architectural historiography, a periphery roughly imitating the shining icons of the centers. Its place on geographical map engender its cultural peripherality, followed by its disciplinarity marginalization. In the perspective of canons and absolute values, to quote this time Bruno Sevi, Eastern Europe has no reason indeed to figure within the mainstream pre-canonic and canonic text. And I'm using pre-canonic and canonic in the same way that Paulo does. And for instance, he names in the pre-canonic Pevsner and his Pioneer of Modern Design in 36, and then an outline of European architecture in 43, and of course Gideon's Space-Time and Architecture in 1940. And in the canonic text, Zelli's Storia dell'Architettura Moderna in 1950, Hitchcock's Architecture 19th and 20th Century in 58, Benevolo and his Modern History of Architecture in 1960. As Scrivano pointed out, Zelli aspired to purge architectural history of its, I quote, numerous prosaic debris, this is the quotation from Zelli, numerous prosaic debris, numerous imitators, and numerous minor works, end of the quote. If ever allotted, Eastern Europe's place on the historiographical map is secured by an acknowledged participation in the mainstream discourse. Thus, Russian constructivists, sometimes completed by the urban experiments from the early 1930s, and Czech functionalism appeared as the regularly but briefly quoted example, the usual suspects. Even historians who followed in the steps of the Kunstgeography, this is the geohistory, further one developed by Thomas da Costa Kaufmann. So even those who were interested in this geohistory, such as Udo Pultermann, who had a clear interest in the architecture of peripheries, got trapped by the normative force of the canon. Pultermann's contemporary architecture in 67 displays 1 page for Eastern Europe versus 6 pages for South America. There is no polarized discrimination here, though politics is surreptitiously involved, but a vision built around the narrative of modernism, much better and spectacularly represented in South American countries. No wonder that under such authoritative modernist framework, Eastern Europe scholars chose to follow in the steps of the same narrative. The best example, and also a pioneer in its geographical field, is East European Modernism, published in 1996, with essays by Czech, Polish, and Hungarian scholars. While introducing a hardly known geography to a larger Western readership, the book remained on the safe side, both chronologically, expanding the top of interwar modernism, and geographically. No former Yugoslavia, or Bulgaria, nor Romania, which seems still so far from the Western canon. 2 years later, Akos Moravanski broke the pattern and turned modernism into a simple architectural alternative, among others. which takes us to particularists and back to barbarians. Moravanski's book made Eastern Europe suddenly interesting for its difference, for its competing vision. Among these latter competing visions, identity was to become the rising methodology turned into a niche narrative further on in analyzing Eastern European topics. Examined either under its aesthetical dimension or its political charge, identity was turned into a trademark, if not into a different canon. Deprived of a meaningful history, Eastern Europe had to prove that at least its geography, dressed up in folkloric clothes, could provide interest for Western audience, and of course that I couldn't resist to these images from the museum. It is true that identity issues were prominent among the architects from Eastern Europe countries. Specificity and particularism was first an imposed figure. Oh, sorry. Oh, that means that maybe I put it. Oh yeah, here I go. So it's so they appeared first as an imposed figure in order to step into the historicity of the civilized West, to become afterwards a strategy of visibility. In the wake of new and critical regionalism, Western scholars started to look as well at Eastern European identity issues. If the later editions of Gideon's, in the later, editions of Gideon's seminal space-time architecture mention one phrase on Central Europe, and this inside the chapter on Scandinavian regionalism, which we can wonder why. 4 decades and a methodological shift later, Barry Bertel, and here is Barry, takes his time to analyze architectural nationalism in Hungary. In 2006, 3 books were teasing this architectural identity on Eastern Europe, all 3 authored by Western scholars, Elizabeth Clegg, Jeremy Howard, and Anthony Olofsson. I would like to briefly stop on Olofsson's approach, which used identity as a methodological tool. Starting from the premise that the Central European architecture has, I quote, a limited ability to speak to us now, he consequently structured his study around the notion of language. And here you cannot really read his chapters in the book, The Language of History, The Language of Organicism, The Language of Rationalism, The Language of Myth, The Language of Hybridity. So thus, structuring his study around the notion of language, he provided an architectural translation of the Hertzian national theory. All national culture is based on a specific language. By doing so, he succeeded both to introduce the Western reader to the unknown architecture of Central Europe and to confirm the marginal position of this latter, which once again needed a code in order to be understood. 2 important things are at stake here. As a periphery, Central Europe, which is quite funny to speak about the central thing as a periphery, requires contextualization. The map at the beginning of the book, and you can see it here, is the first tool of contextualization, and we can wonder how many maps we see in books speaking about mainstream discourse, of course. Geographical contextualization comes together with conceptual contextualization. Paradoxically, these are the chapters that I read for you before. Paradoxically, the concepts proposed by Olofsson decontextualize the subject of his book, since they create connections with the methodology of the mainstream discourse. Looking closer, they remind one Peter Collins' chapter in his Changing Ideals in Modern Architecture in 65, Romanticism, Revivalism, Functionalism, the biological analogy, the linguistic analogy, and so on. Using identity as a key to understand the architecture of Eastern Europe was not new. In the late 1980s, a number of Western architectural journals, Architecture and Urbanism, Architecture of the AIA Journal, Architects, and so on, published articles on Hungarian organic architecture. Unfortunately, I didn't have an image from before 89, so this is from 1990. Topics like organicism and historicism that were hot, at that moment for various reasons, postmodernists in the first place, allowed thus to provide a larger visibility for, I quote, this new movement that reflects indigenous forms and materials, end of the quote, and this is the title of one of the articles. And the notable detail, half of the articles published in the Cold War period were about Hungarian organicism, according to Index. And now on politics. During the Cold War, politics blurred considerably both the information and understanding of what happened behind the Iron Curtain. For different reasons, access to information was a challenging issue on both sides, though not insurmountable. The absence of references on Eastern Europe in the Western canonic texts would be related, though not at all exclusively, to the lack of information. When Frampton wrote in Modern Architecture Critical History in 1980 on Czech functionalism that he considered inadequately represented in architectural histories, he used a 1970 local publication, Dostal, Pechar, and Prohaska, Modern Architecture in Czechoslovakia. Similar publications on Romanian and Bulgarian architecture had been released around the same date. Did Frampton ignore them because he was not aware, or simply because he did not consider these countries as significant for the modern architectural narrative? However, bibliography on Eastern Europe architecture was apparently not so inaccessible to Western specialists as proof the chapter published on his on this topic by the American architectural writer and photographer G.E. Kidder-Smith in his New Architecture of Europe. Oops, you were not supposed to hear now. So this is a book published in '61. And let me quote you from the beginning on his note on Eastern Europe. Although in recent years I have been unable to visit any of the countries of Eastern Europe, conversation with nationals visiting the United States and study of the Polish, Czech, Hungarian, Yugoslav, Romanian, and Soviet architectural magazines and books give cause for considerable architectural hope. End of the quote. His sources remains, alas, mysterious, since he completely forgets to quote them in the bibliography section. Kidder-Smith's choice to present European architecture as a whole, discarding the political division, is meritorious given the scope of his book, which was to present, I quote again, the provocative post-war architectural achievements of Europe, end of the quote. Still, his reason for architectural hope in the Soviet satellite countries was their turning towards modernism in general and Western models in particular. In his 3 pages note on Eastern Europe out of 320 pages, people and places from the area are quoted in relation to Western references. Brno is, I quote, the city of Mies van der Rohe's famous Tugendhathaus, end of the quote. While Hungary is, I quote, the land that for its population that has in our time given more creativity to the world than in any other, and which sent to the USA Marcel Breuer, Roland Wang, Georgi Kepes, and the late Moholy-Nagy, among others. End of the quote. Architecture in Zagreb is praised for reminding one Le Corbusier and that of the Romanian Black Sea coast. Here you see the image. For its resemblance to Brazilia's presidential palace, though, I quote again, in a clumsy fashion. Kidder-Smith's book reveals 2 things. One is the importance of the yet unstudied networks of Eastern European architects that have emigrated to Western world. The other is the place that Eastern European subjects were given in the pages of Western periodicals, like Architecture d'aujourd'hui, far from the most interested, Casabella, Domus, Architecture and Urbanism, Progressive Architecture, and so on and so on. The discrepancy of interest shown to Eastern Europe by architectural books on the one hand and periodicals on the other could pertain to their different policies. Periodicals were meant to inform, offering a raw material to be decanted later by the selective eye of history, while books aim to provide a rational framing the canon. But actually, the periodicals deal with the canon as well. Most of the articles presented Eastern European architecture as an expanded field for the Western models. I quote, a recent visitor placed current Polish architecture, quote, within the quote, somewhere between Scandinavia and Brasilia. Certainly, it has gone a long way from Red Square, end of the quote, noted a 1962 article from Architectural Forum. Entitled Communist New Look, the surprising architecture of 4 Eastern European nations, the article explained, I quote again, the work of communist architects at its worst may be a drab of somehow disturbing reflection on Western cliché, at its best, it is representative of the mainstream of modern building, competent and occasionally exciting. End of the quote. However close to the Western canon and thus decontextualized from its political background, the architecture of the communist countries needed contextualization. 2 facts are needed for a correct understanding of contemporary Bulgarian architecture. This is how starts an article suggestively entitled Bulgaria Builds, published in '66 in Architectural Review. And which are these facts? Geographic and climatic conditions of the country. After 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, many hoped that the tension of contextualizing, decontextualizing will eventually come to an end. Thomas da Costa Kaufmann, fervent advocate of the geohistory and somehow an inheritor from this point of view of Szygovsky's work, affirmed enthusiastically in the introduction of his court, cloister, and city, the art of Central Europe, 1450 to 1800, his belief into a mutation of art history. When the wall fell, Kaufmann was in West Berlin working on his book. Without any doubt, Kaufmann was right. The dismantling of the Soviet bloc induced a mutation in the art and architectural historiography. However, the changes were neither that rapid nor that radical that one could have expected. If Europe was not balkanized in 1930s, as claimed Mitic, it was provincialized, to quote Dipesh Chakrabarty in 2000. And this happened not only because the field of architectural history has considerably and suddenly expanded, but also because the rules of the game changed without really changing. A global history of architecture barely floated, using once more the same examples of the pre-2000 historiography. In exchange, other peripheries got more visible, thus earning a more central place in the new narratives. If Eastern Europe appears to have skipped its status of periphery, let me say again, too central, not enough spectacular from the point of view of the otherness, it was turned into a provincial territory of architectural history. One that needs to be heavily contextualized in order to find a place in the vast arena of the mainstream historiography. The contextualization applies both to its ordinariness, which requires new methodologies, and to its extraordinaries, which exploits the peculiarities of the communist former bloc. But I think that we can make things happen. I do not mean that contextualization is just about tactics. Recent architectural historiography benefited immensely of these approaches, which helped forging new methodologies. Contextualization is an important means for getting another understanding of the object of our discipline. And Eastern Europe, as a field of study, contributed, as a matter of fact, greatly to refining these new approaches. One of the most recent publications, Modernism, it is just in the middle, Modernism in Between, that was released a few months ago, is a perfect example for consistently situating former Yugoslavia in a narrative which is meaningful both for East and West. Eastern Europe's architecture has its own objects, ordinariness, vernacular, which require specific tools. Both topics that I mentioned before suppose an interdisciplinary methodology, one that started to preoccupy, by the way, the new art history, almost at the same time when Eastern Europe stepped into the enlarged historiography. For instance, which started to develop already before 1989 in the Western milieus, gained a new importance and thanks to the Eastern European topics. Politics, sociology, anthropology, matters of transfers, these latter reminding one the approach of the interwar art history towards an integrated vision of fluxes and dynamics, are concrete example of such methodologies developed in studying Eastern Europe. Let me cite only two such approaches which contributed to expand the methodological approaches in our discipline. David Crowley's political and anthropological interest and Akos Morawatsky's research on transfers that is now continuously extended and enlarged by Lukács Stanek. I believe that margins, in general, informed in an important manner the recent historiography, including Eastern Europe, which will still have a role to play, I think so, in refining the tools and methodologies of our discipline. Thank you very much.